I remember this night like the back of my hand. It was one of the scariest experiences of my young life, a night I will never forget. It was late around 10 p.m. at night. I was fast asleep when I was violently woken up as I had seen two red eyes stare at me from my dream. I had suddenly woken up from a nightmare. It was something I had never experienced before. Suddenly, the crack of thunder hit violently into the nighttime sky. It sounded like someone was pounding me over and over with a sledgehammer. The pain was agonizing. A few seconds later, I had a splitting headache. I blinked a few times in my bed and took a few deep breaths, and I quietly got to my feet. I quietly walked down to the kitchen to look for some Advil, trying not to wake my parents or sister in the process. However, after a wild nighttime goose chase, I found the Advil in one of the cupboards in the kitchen. I walked back to my room quickly, as I was still tired. To my shock, the door was closed. However, I strongly remember that I had left it open. I slowly approached and opened my door and walked into my room. I turned the lights on. However, my bedroom was fine. I'd gotten back under the covers. A few minutes later, I had a strong feeling I was being watched by someone or something. This feeling woke me right up. It felt like I was in Amityville or a very haunted location, and I had a presence angry with me. I opened my eyes, and standing in front of my bed was one of the scariest experiences of my life. A shadow-like creature was standing height and tall over my bed, staring down at me. He had a long snout and antlers on his head. Similar to an anteater but with antlers, like a buck. His body was like a human's but not his hands instead of fingers. They were claws, very sharp claws. And down where his feet would be were more claws, but they were sticking through his shoes he was wearing over his feet. He suddenly started growling at me. It was definitely a demonic growl, the kind of growl that could shatter a window in an instant. The worst part was, it had started approaching my bed. Suddenly I was completely paralyzed. From head to toe, all I could do was watch in complete horror and terror as his hand reached out and slowly touched my forehead. The entire room at that moment turned blood red. My breathing had stopped. I could not scream. I could not run. I could not do anything. All I could do was watch in absolute horror. As the creature slowly got onto its feet and on my bedroom floor, I heard the sound of the floor sink down as it stood on the ground for the first time. And then it let out a loud shriek and started to lift itself into the air as if it was flying, but stayed in one spot as if it was levitating, and it was. In that instance, it suddenly turned away from me, and once it had walked out of my bedroom, then, in an instant, my room was back the way it had always been, not blood red. And I could move again. I had been a victim of something called sleep paralysis. This happened when I was 6, 20 years ago, and I still remember it vividly because I haven't gone more than a couple months without replaying it back in my head. I remember waking up from a creepy dream and lying in bed for a minute. Then my mum opened the door and I could see her silhouette. Was she there to comfort me, possibly? She didn't say anything. She then eerily waddled into my room and started looking a little more creepy. She looked a little like a creature from where the wild things are. I could only see the dark outline of her body and head, but her hair appeared messy and her head looked larger than normal. I was on the top bunk. My baby sister was asleep below. My mum stood at my bed. Her head was about level with my own. She stood there for a minute at the side of my bunk bed, and I could begin to sense that things were weird. She then reached out and started tickling me a little. I wasn't freaked out quite yet. Then I began to feel uncomfortable, but the tickling intensified. She began grunting quietly, almost as if she was murmuring something. Finally, I was trying to tell her to stop, but of course, words were impossible to form. The tickling intensified until she was scratching and jabbing and digging at my torso. By then, the grunting had eventually grown into a deep growling and howling. I couldn't move or make any noise. Why wouldn't my little sister wake up and help me? Scariest fucking thing that's ever happened to me. I've had quite a few, from just feelings of a presence to a full-blown figure. Sometimes there are voices, sometimes it is dead silent. but the masked man was in another league of bone-chilling. It started with me, wake up to a deep-throated chuckling. Having been one of my later experiences of sleep paralysis, I knew immediately that it was that. I resigned myself to another sleepless, creepy night when the door opened. A man stepped through, in a mask as red as blood. The mask itself was demonic in nature, with big underfangs like a boar's, with unnatural, outlandish twist and turns in the cheeks, and a deep, set, wrinkled brow. But the worst part were they eyes. His violet serpentine eyes bulged out of the mask. They looked like they were about to pop. He was wearing a rich-colored brown robe, with a hood pulled up covering the rest of his head, drawing all attention to the mask and those dreadful eyes. He pulled a squirming burlap sack behind him, and he stopped when he got to the foot of my bed. He stared at me for a long moment, and then reached in the bag. One by one, he pulled everyone I had ever loved, cared about, or considered a friend. Each time he pulled them out, he positioned them so I was looking directly into their eyes. And he took his hand, a gnarled, bony thing, with skin drawn so tight it looked as if he had none at all, and drew his long, sharp nail across their throats, spilling torrents of blood at my feet. I had to watch the life drain out of the eyes of everyone I had ever truly known, and deep in those eyes I could terror mixing with pity in each and every one of them. And only after his bag was empty did he let it drop, and he began walking around my bed. He stopped as he towered over me. Leaning down, he reached to me and gently stroked my fave with his blood-stained nail. With his other hand, he reached and pulled off his mask. I cannot honestly put it into words what I saw beneath that mask. It was an ever-changing face of horror. It twisted and squirmed and never remained still for long, and each facial reconstruction was more terrifying than the last. As I looked into his violet serpentine eyes, he spoke to me. I still remember the words well enough to quote them verbatim, but as they were profoundly disturbing and personal in nature, I do not care to repeat them to anyone. But the last thing he said was, "Enjoy the time you have left, because soon your life will be mine, and your soul as well." And he said this, his face finally settled onto a single form. It was my own face. My night shifts started erratically. I did not see it coming, but it was a welcome change, primarily because we are compensated in the form of extra bucks to work through the night in IT while the whole world is sleeping. How very satisfying, I thought. My hour anyway. I did not have to bump into people. They make life tough, living hard anyway. I congratulated myself secretly and got to it. Unfortunately, it was short-lived. A certain someone on my team was going through a financial crunch. He asked for it, and I reluctantly dethroned. What I did not pay attention to was the spike in my graph of sleeping habits. It got terribly disturbed. I was having trouble sleeping the first few days. One night I dozed off early with a heavy head. I was deep in a slumber when my eyes flicked open. I sensed someone standing right next to my bed towards my left. Stock still, I sensed my body failing me. Too terrified to turn around and look at it, I sensed it furious. He was breathing heavily. My first instinct was to run towards the light switch to see what it was. That's what I did. I sprang up and ran towards the switch, which was next to my room's door, then managed to press the button, but the light did not switch on. I turned around to look, and I was taken aback. There, I saw my very own body lying there on the bed, but I hadn't moved a bit. Within moments, I was once again in my body, once again feeling the heavy breathing that was coming from my left. I was dead scared. In the background, my clock ticked. The noise grew louder and louder. I slept there helpless, knowing that turning my head could be fatal, yet I tried with all my might to slowly move my head. But I could not move my head, let alone turn it. The room began to grow darker. I wasn't dreaming, I was so damn sure of it. Also, I wasn't asleep. I was stuck in between, smacked somewhere between two different worlds, paralyzed, without me having any control over my body. I laid there for a while, trying to figure out if I was dead. All those terrifying movie scenes began to visit. Must be the afterlife, and maybe I might have ended up in hell. Some more moments passed when I sprang back to life again. The first thing I did was switch on the lights, of course. I turned around to look. There was nothing but my ebony cupboard next to my bed. But he was right there. I couldn't go back to bed then. The incident had me trembling like a leaf. My first time having sleep paralysis was after one of my very first paranormal experiences. I lived in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, in a neighborhood called Linden Oaks that was notorious for scary shit. I was about 10-11 and was so close to being asleep when I heard a little girl crying. My 11-year-old brain took that as my body just going into a dream until the crying got louder and louder until it was almost more like screaming in my ear. I grabbed my safety stuffed animal and ran to my parents' room and slept with them. I remember really clearly, it was about 2:30 in the morning. Around 3:30, I had woken up again hearing static on the TV in my parents' room, and for some reason, it scared me more than hearing a little girl crying. I felt utterly terrified and tried to wake up my mum, and that's when I realized I couldn't move. I lifted my arm maybe 2 inches before it slammed back down on the bed. I couldn't move my head, and when I tried to speak, all that came out was mo. I could really only ever get the beginning of mom out. It felt like someone was on my chest, holding me down with their own body. I couldn't breathe good either. It was so heavy. I could see a shadow at the doorway just standing there, watching me. It felt like it was getting gratification from my fear. And I could see 3 orbs just floating above me. It weirdly enough looked like they were fighting, but I won't say they were. Maybe that's just how my brain took it. There were 2 white ones and a red one. I remember being stuck like that, watching the shadow and orbs for about 10 minutes. Or at least that's what it felt like. I was finally able to close my eyes, and when I opened them, I could move. And I woke my mum and dad up so fast, I was terrified and crying. My parents were concerned for sure because I was never one to wake up freaking out, even when I would have nightmares. My experiences are what made my parents believers in the paranormal. My second time was about 4 years or so ago. I was just turning 18. It was literally the night before my birthday. I had my 2 best friends sleeping over. One was sleeping on the floor, the other was in the bed with me. I was facing my wall, and I had a mirror on it at the time. I remember being woken up to both of my dogs growling very, very lowly. I went to move to calm them down, and that's when I realized I couldn't. That's also when I realized what they were growling at. It sounded like someone was taking the screen to my window that was behind me off. But that would be impossible. My room is on the 2nd floor of our house. It felt like I was waiting there forever, listening to my screen being taken off. I was looking wherever I could since I didn't have much of a view of my room. My eyes landed on my mirror, and as they did, I saw the window open. 3 people slithered in. Literally, it just looked like they slithered into the room. My room has tall ceilings now, being probably about 8 feet at the lowest and about 15 at the highest. Well, 2 of these 3 people were tall. They were exactly the same height, and their heads were touching the mid part of my ceiling. The other one was very, very short, probably about 5'3" or so. That's just a guess. The 2 tall ones were wearing pure white plague doctor outfits, and the short one was in an all-black plague doctor outfit. Plague doctors have always freaked me out a bit, so to have 3 standing behind me while I couldn't move was terrifying. I started crying, and my dogs were just laying there growling at them, but they wouldn't leave the bed. It's like they were paralyzed too or something. I don't know. The 3 people stared at me for a minute, and I felt and saw the one in black touch my back, and I heard him say purity in the most guttural sounding voice I've ever heard. After that, they simply left the way they came, and I could move again after that. I looked around, and my friends were still asleep, but my dogs weren't. They were still up, growling at the window. I woke my friends up and told them what happened, because I was freaking out. They said they couldn't really explain it, but brushed it off as a pure dream. But I didn't wake up. Once they left, I could move completely and woke them up. I can't explain it at all, but that night was so fear-inducing, and I've had a hard time sleeping ever since. My scariest sleep paralysis was like a coded cryptic message, which I have not deciphered to this very day, though the dreadful incident occurred over 2 decades in the past. It happened during the witching hour, when the irksome portrait of a decrepit old woman, allegedly painted by Salvador Dali when he was only 14 years of age, appeared to me in my slumber. I think part of the reason the mysterious personage disturbed me so deeply was because the antiquated portrait somehow reminded me of my deceased maternal grandmother, whom I loved very much. The dry, wrinkly, geriatric lips became animated as the faded image told me a vexing story that made no sense at all. I was in a musty room full of people I didn't recognize. There was something threatening about all of them. I felt imminent danger, as though my life were in grave peril. I wanted to get out of that sordid, dreary room. I was desperate to jump up from the settee by the fireplace and run far, far away as fast as I could. But of course I was utterly immobilized by sleep paralysis and therefore could not move a single muscle. I was helpless as a newborn babe. The horror of the hideous thing was unbearable. The weird story the old portrait woman told went like this. From an unknown origin, far out over the cold, dark North Atlantic, the freak storm surged over the island, knocking out electrical power to the inn. The guests, who were all in their rooms when the place went dark, began peeping furtively out into the shadowy halls to see whether anyone else was about, or if they were all alone in the spooky old inn during a blackout. Candles were lit, and one by one, the little groups of guests made their way quietly down the creaking stairs to the parlor where Stilton had stoked a log blaze in the huge stone fireplace. At first, nobody spoke a word, but then someone grew bold enough to inquire when the electricity might be restored, and this prosaic question broke the ice to start a low murmur of uncertain voices. From where he stood by the front doors, Broom saw people creeping by candlelight. He didn't want to go up to his room by himself in the darkness, so he crossed the gloom of the lobby to join the guests gathering in the parlor. The blaze on the stone hearth was throwing vigorously burning red-orange flames up into the chimney, a serpent-like hissing raised goose flesh as heat from the ravenous flames dried water out of the green logs. Volatile sap in the peony and spruce burst with sharp snaps like firecrackers. Golden glowing sparks clung to the soot-cacked, forward-sloping back of the oversized Count Romford fireplace. The fear brick were chippered and cracked with age. The rising wind moaned and sobbed like a ghost in the smokestack. Outside, the incessant tumult of the slashing gale pounded at the walls and thrashed at the windows. Some of the guests sat motionless, staring silently into the hypnotically dancing flames. Fueled by the grim, unfathomable abyss of the icy North Atlantic, the immutable elementals did, on this dreadful night, wield their mysterious power as a foreshadowing of macabre fate. The guests of Avgrunen Arms were about to be introduced to the cryptic secret of the 200-year-old haunted seaside inn. Leaving her husband warming himself by the fire, Debbie walked to a section of wall between two bookshelves. "What is this unusual painting?" she asked aloud. As if any of the other guests would know something she didn't about the decor of the antediluvian Avgrunen Arms. "It looks like a portrait of a woman, yet if so, she doesn't seem to be all there. It's as if she is ethereal, fading in and out, her complexion on the one side of her face that is developed enough to discern as human. Well, I don't know. It's somehow sickly looking, eerie. It gives one a chill to look at it. And her hair, she seems to have the features of youth, but her hair appears to be a bluish gray, like that of an old woman. See how, like a wild leaping phantom. Her long, voluminous hair flows out behind her in the night-born sea breeze of the Northern Ocean as it washes through her silvery locks." "Debbie," Maud Upton cringed, "your vivid description of that old painting is so ghoulish. Why do you say night-born?" Debbie, still closely examining the unorthodox portrait, cocked her head to one side. "Well, Maud, the painting is obviously a night scene. Look in the top left corner where the moon rises over her. She seems to float at the railing of a balcony with a rooftop behind her. If I didn't know otherwise, I'd say she is poised atop this very inn." "And you would be correct, my dear." Duke Devlin had entered the room unnoticed. Startled, all the guests jumped a little at his authoritative reply. "That is a portrait of the blind widow," said he, coming to a stand beside the nervously curious Debbie. "The blind widow?" "Yes, there is quite a haunting tale about her. She was the young bride of the infamous Borkum von Ripper, skipper of the Nightmare. The Nightmare was by far the most prosperous of the whaling vessels who called Barrenfield their home port. Captain von Ripper was notorious as a violent brute, and it was whispered among the villagers that his unusually good luck with whaling came about as a result of him striking a deal with the devil. His young bride's name was Melissa. The painting which you are now admiring is reputed to be a portrait of the young lady, or rather, a portrait of her ghost. Her ghost? Yes, frightfully romantic, isn't it? According to the old stories, her brutish husband was so jealous of her alluring beauty that he imprisoned her in the garret room at the top of this mansion to hide her from the lustful eyes of all the strapping young lads who inhabited the village of Barrenfield during its prosperous years as a whaling port. Devlin's eyes spiraled as he recounted the tragic tale, but he released his psychic grip on Debbie for the moment, allowing her to return her dreamy gaze to the spectral painting. The barbaric captain of the nightmare kept the lovely Melissa locked in attic darkness, only permitting her to come out at night. He didn't even let her light a lantern or candle by which to see her way, because he was determined that no man other than himself should get even the slightest glimpse of his beautiful young wife. She was kept in darkness for so long that her eyes became sensitive to light. A bitter maidservant in the employ of Captain von Ripper saw to it that his despairing spouse remained confined in darkness during his absence. But eventually, there was a voyage from which the tyrannical captain did not return. Word of his demise finally reached this island. Captain von Ripper had been killed in a shark attack brought on by the blood of a harpooned whale. When the hateful maidservant received news of the gruesome fate of her wicked master, she dropped dead on the spot. The pretty, yet horribly oppressed Melissa was free at last. She burst from her attic prison and dashed outside into the brilliant sunshine of high noon. She was instantly blinded by the bright daylight. Stumbling and tumbling down the slope to the point, she fell over into the swirling water of the deep Barrenfield Harbour entrance channel. A powerful outgoing tide swept the helpless lass out to sea, where, sadly, she drowned. The legend of Blind Widow Point, Debbie muttered, gazing trance-like at the ghost portrait of the poor young wife of the sinister whaling captain. Exactly. Her ghost now haunts this antiquated seaside inn. A low rumble of thunder reverberated through the old parlour. The flames in the fireplace crackled, throwing sparks up into the chimney. During the 2 warm months of this island's brief summers, the creepy Devlin continued, the ghost of the blind widow is seen in the courtyard on moonlit nights. She wanders there alone, as if searching for something. She glides around the fountain and through the fragrant balm of the herb garden. In autumn and winter, whenever the weather is particularly violent, such as it is tonight, she stalks the widow's walk, gazing with her dark, hollow eye sockets out over the sloshing swells of the North Atlantic, sobbing and weeping for that which she has lost. Many guests at Avgrunnen Arms have seen her. A travelling artist who came here to paint seascapes along the rugged Barrenfield shoreline rendered this oil sketch of the blind widow. It is a sorrowful and haunting painting, but guests who have seen the grieving ghost confirm that the artist's portrait is a good likeness of the forlorn apparition. Suddenly Devlin turned his head sharply, as if he had heard a noise which troubled him. He stared in silence for a moment at the shadowed corridor outside the parlour, then abruptly said, "Excuse me for a moment, won't you?" Nodding a stately farewell to Debbie and the other guests, he walked swiftly from the room and disappeared into the dark recesses of the old inn. "Well, that was weird," Prissy quipped sarcastically in a coquettish attempt to lure attention from the twin boys. It worked. They came to sit beside her, one at her left, the other at her right, on the long sofa. Penny, who was holding her pale hands out to the blaze in the fireplace, eyed the flirtation with contempt. She looked away and huffed in disgust. The hour was growing late on this dark and stormy night. There was a chill of ill boding in the grave atmosphere of the Gothic parlour. Gradually, everyone huddled closer to the fulgent log fire, which the bellboy had stoked higher than usual due to the unexpected emergency. The guests thought they remembered seeing the bellboy when they began entering the parlour, although no one knew where he was at the moment. Nobody could figure out how Stilton had built up such a big blazing fire, then disappeared without being noticed. The scorching conflagration roared furiously up the chimney. Wildly gyrating shadows, thrown by the flickering red-orange flames, cast a suspicious mood over everyone in the room. The crackling log fire wickedly animated cheerless faces. When would the electricity be restored? When would the lights come back on? Something like this recently happened to me, and it was weird. I was falling asleep, just randomly searching on my phone, so I put my phone on the charger and laid down. About 20 minutes later, I woke up, and when I opened my eyes, the light hue in the room was green, kind of like what you would see if you had a black light on in the room. But instead, the color was green. The view I was seeing was as if I was laying in my back, where I usually sleep, looking straight ahead. I couldn't breathe, like someone was choking me, and I couldn't move, and out of my peripheral I couldn't see someone standing beside me, but couldn't make out who it was. There is definitely a negative feeling that goes along with the entire situation right from the beginning. I was confused about what actually was going on because of the color of the lighting. Not to mention, this had never happened to me before, so I blinked a few times, and then I saw myself and my dog laying where I was laying, kind of like how you would hear someone describe an out-of-body experience, how they describe actually looking at their own bodies. So I immediately thought, well, okay, shit, so I guess I'm dead. Like, where is the light? Because surely this green hue can't be it, with the most extreme feeling of being alone imaginable. And then the next thing I know, the color of the room was normal again, and I was choking and gasping for air as if someone had released my throat from choking me, and my dog was nudging and sniffing and licking me, like checking to make sure I was okay. It couldn't have lasted more than 30 seconds, so there wasn't enough time for it to actually be horrifying, but it was definitely weird, not something I would repeatedly like to experience, and definitely scared the shit out of me when it was all said and done and I was trying to comprehend what in the actual fuck had just happened. Not quite sure what the green color was all about. Thank you for dropping by the archives and listening to our ghastly stories. Don't forget to like, comment, and lastly subscribe. Until next time, archivists, I bid you all good night.